The little wolf pup couldn't have been more than 5. Yet while frightened adults fought over blankets and supplies inside the wildfire relief shelter, he quietly carried a bowl of hot stew across the crowded room, stopping in front of an elderly she-wolf whose hands trembled too much to hold a spoon. "You should eat first," she whispered. The pup smiled and shook his head. "My papa says the strongest wolves make sure everyone else is safe before themselves." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. Across the shelter, Alpha Riker Thorn froze. For a man who had faced rogue packs, blood-soaked battlefields, and enemies twice his size, without flinching, it made no sense that a child's simple words could steal the air from his lungs. Something about the boy demanded his attention. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence. Perhaps it was the calm kindness that reminded him of someone he had spent years trying, and failing, to forget. The pup thanked every volunteer who accepted a tray from him. He apologized when he accidentally bumped into someone. He smiled, even though smoke still lingered outside the shattered windows. Then, the child looked up. Time stopped. Those eyes, bright silver, the exact shade every alpha in the Northern Territories recognized as belonging to the Thorn bloodline. Riker's blood ran cold. The spoon slipped from his hand and struck the floor with a sharp clang. The sound echoed through the shelter, but he barely heard it. The boy tilted his head curiously before walking toward him. "Mister," he asked politely, "are you okay?" Riker couldn't answer. He wasn't looking at the child's face anymore. He was looking at himself. The same silver eyes, the same stubborn jaw, even the tiny scar above the left eyebrow, one Riker had carried since he was a reckless young wolf, was there, as though the moon goddess herself had copied it onto the pup. Impossible. His mate had vanished 5 years ago. There couldn't be a child. There couldn't. Orion. A familiar voice cut through the shelter. One Riker had replayed in his mind every night since the morning he found an empty room and a handwritten note lying where hope used to live. The little pup turned immediately. "I'm here, Papa." Riker slowly lifted his eyes. Standing only a few feet away was the Omega he had searched for across countless territories. Kalen Ashford. His hair was a little longer now. His shoulders carried quiet confidence instead of quiet sorrow. But the gentle warmth in his eyes was exactly as Riker remembered. For one impossible heartbeat, neither of them moved. The roaring shelter disappeared. The wildfire, the volunteers, the noise, none of it mattered. Only the distance between them. Only the little wolf standing innocently in the middle. Orion reached for Kalen's hand before pointing happily toward Riker. "Papa," he said with a bright smile. "The big alpha keeps looking at me." Kalen's expression softened as he knelt beside his son. Then he looked up. Their eyes met for the first time in 5 long years. No anger, no tears, only a silence so heavy it carried every word they had never said. Riker finally understood why the moon goddess had allowed him to survive every battle he had ever fought. Because the hardest one had been waiting here all along, and he had already lost it once. 5 years earlier, no one in Silver Ridge Pack celebrated the moon bond. They celebrated the Alpha. When the sacred ceremony revealed that Alpha Riker Thorn's destined mate was Kalen Ashford, the entire gathering fell unnaturally quiet. Kalen lowered his eyes as whispers spread through the crowd. "An Omega? He's too gentle to stand beside Riker. The pack deserves a stronger Luna." Kalen heard every word. He simply smiled as though none of them hurt. That was who he had always been. He believed kindness was stronger than pride, even when the world insisted otherwise. Riker accepted the bond because rejecting the moon goddess was unthinkable. But acceptance was not the same as welcome. In public, he stood beside Salen, whenever tradition demanded it. In private, there was always another council meeting, another border inspection, another rival Alpha demanding his attention. Every responsibility came before the quiet Omega, waiting for him at home. Yet Kalen never complained. Each morning, He woke before sunrise to prepare breakfast for the patrol warriors. He memorized every elder's medicine, comforted frightened pups after nightmares, and quietly helped struggling families without asking for recognition. Before every dangerous patrol, he stitched a tiny silver thread inside Riker's jacket, a silent blessing for his safe return. Riker never noticed, or perhaps he never stopped long enough to ask who had done it. Evenings were the hardest. Kalen would leave a warm meal, waiting on the dining table, long after it had grown cold. Some nights Riker returned after midnight. Some nights he never came home at all. Still, Kalen always lit the lantern beside the window, a promise that someone would be waiting, a promise he kept for 3 long years. Then, one autumn morning, the elders announced the upcoming Moon Summit, a gathering of the most powerful alphas in the Northern Territories. Riker called it the most important event in Silver Ridge's history. Kalen smiled and wished him success. Deep inside, he quietly hoped that, just once, his mate would remember they were supposed to face the future together. He had no idea that the summit would become the beginning of the end. The Moon Summit brought together the most powerful wolves in the Northern Territories. For 3 days, Silver Ridge overflowed with visiting alphas, Lunae, and pack elders. Every conversation was about alliances, trade agreements, and preparing for the growing threat of rogue wolves. Riker moved through the gathering like the alpha everyone expected him to be. Confident, respected, untouchable. Kalen stayed quietly at his side, greeting guests with the same gentle warmth that had earned the affection of ordinary pack members, even if it had never fully earned his mate's attention. Late on the second evening, Riker stepped onto the grand platform to announce a new alliance with Ironclaw Pack. Beside him stood Alpha Darius Blackwood, a warrior known throughout the territories for his strength and influence. Riker raised a goblet. "Silver Ridge's future has never been stronger," he declared. "With Alpha Darius standing beside us, our pack will become the greatest force these territories have ever known." The hall erupted in applause, but whispers quickly followed. The Alpha finally found someone worthy. Now that is a leader who matches him. I always wondered why he settled for an Omega. Every word reached Kalen. He looked toward Riker, hoping, just hoping, that his mate would correct the misunderstanding. Riker simply acknowledged the applause and continued speaking about strategy. He never saw the tears gathering behind Kalen's quiet smile. Or perhaps, he believed Kalen would endure the humiliation, as he always had. That night, after the celebrations ended, Kalen returned to the pack house alone. He folded a few clothes into a single travel bag. Carefully, he removed the Luna crest from his jacket and placed it on the desk. Beside it, he left one handwritten note. "A bond without respect is only a chain." Before dawn, he stood one last time outside the home he had filled with hope for 3 years. His hand rested gently over his stomach. A life was growing beneath his heart. Their pup, Riker didn't know, and after tonight, he never would. As the first light of morning touched the mountains, Kalen walked away from Silver Ridge without looking back. When Riker finally returned home hours later, the house was silent. Only the note remained. Kalen never stopped walking until Silver Ridge was far behind him. The first few months were the hardest. He had little money, no title, and no pack to call home. Some wolves recognized the former Luna and asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. Others assumed he had been rejected by his alpha. Kalen never corrected them. He simply thanked them for their kindness and kept moving. Eventually, he found refuge in a small mountain community called Pine Hollow, where wolves cared more about character than bloodlines or rank. For the first time in years, no one looked at him with pity. When winter arrived, so did his son. Kalen named him Orion. The tiny pup inherited his gentle smile, but his eyes, they were unmistakably Riker's. Every time Orion laughed, Kalen was reminded of the family that might have been. Yet he refused to let bitterness become part of his son's childhood. As Orion grew older, he often asked innocent questions. "Papa, Why don't I have another parent like my friends? Kalen would pull him close and kiss the top of his head. Sometimes good people make painful mistakes before they learn what truly matters. He never spoke badly about Riker, because Orion deserved the freedom to discover his father for himself one day. Meanwhile, back in Silver Ridge, the pack slowly began to change. Riker won every border dispute. He defeated every rival challenge. His reputation continued to grow across the northern territories. Yet inside his own lands, something was quietly breaking. Families no longer gathered at the pack house. Young warriors transferred to neighboring packs, where they felt heard. Trusted elders retired earlier than expected. The Alpha ruled through strength, but strength alone couldn't inspire loyalty. Only then did Riker begin to notice the emptiness Kalen had left behind. He searched neighboring territories, questioned traveling merchants, sent scouts across distant packs. No one could find the Omega who had disappeared without a trace. 5 years passed. Then, one dry summer, a wildfire swept across the mountain territories, forcing packs to unite in rescuing displaced families. Without hesitation, Riker volunteered to lead Silver Ridge's relief mission. He had no way of knowing. Fate was about to lead him to the family he never knew he still had. The relief shelter was crowded with exhausted wolves who had escaped the wildfire with little more than the clothes they wore. Despite the smoke still hanging in the air, volunteers worked tirelessly, carrying blankets, serving meals, and comforting frightened pups. Riker moved through the shelter, delivering crates of medicine. Then he saw the little boy again. Orion was carefully arranging food on a table, making sure every elderly wolf received a meal before taking one for himself. The child couldn't have been older than 5, yet there was something remarkably familiar about the way he carried himself. Not proud, not loud, simply determined to help. Riker found himself watching from across the room. When Orion smiled, it reminded him of someone he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. Then the pup looked directly at him. Those silver eyes caught the light. Riker's breath hitched. He knew those eyes. He had seen them every morning in his own reflection. Before he could make sense of it, Orion walked over with a small bowl of soup. "You look tired, mister," the little pup said politely. "Papa says helping others is easier when you've eaten." Riker accepted the bowl without taking his eyes off the child. "What's your name?" "Orion." "And your father?" The boy pointed toward the entrance. "My papa's over there." Riker slowly turned. His heart stopped. Kalen stood in the doorway carrying a box of medical supplies. The years had changed him. There was quiet confidence in the way he walked now. The sadness Riker remembered had been replaced by a calm strength that could only come from surviving pain. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Everything around them faded into silence. Orion looked between them, smiling innocently. "Papa!" This nice Alpha said hello. Kalen walked over, resting a gentle hand on Orion's shoulder. Then, with remarkable composure, he looked at Riker. "It's been a long time." Riker's voice barely worked. Kalen nodded before he could finish. "Yes." The single word shattered every excuse Riker had carried for 5 years. He hadn't only lost his mate, he had missed his son's first steps, his first words, his first howl beneath the full moon. And no battle he had ever won could erase that loss. Riker wanted to explain, to apologize, to ask 100 questions at once. Instead, he stood there in silence, realizing that no words could return the 5 years he had lost. "I'm sorry," he said at last. Kalen's expression didn't change. "So am I." Before Riker could say anything else, Orion gently tugged on Kalen's hand. "Papa, the little pups still need blankets." Kalen smiled at his son. "Then let's help them." Without another word, they walked away together. Riker didn't follow. For the first time in his life, he understood that being Alpha gave him authority over a pack, not over another person's heart. The following morning, He returned to the shelter before sunrise. Not to speak, to work. He repaired damaged kennels, unloaded supply trucks, and carried lumber until his hands blistered. When volunteers stopped for lunch, Riker remained behind, clearing fallen trees from the road. No one had ordered him to. Days turned into weeks. Whenever Orion had a school gathering, Riker quietly stood in the back, applauding every achievement without expecting the little pup to run into his arms. When homes damaged by the wildfire needed rebuilding, he picked up a hammer instead of giving commands. The wolves who once feared him watched in stunned silence. Their alpha had stopped asking, "Who will serve the pack?" He had started asking, "Who still needs help?" Orion slowly grew curious. "Papa," he whispered one evening, "why does that alpha keep smiling whenever he sees us?" Kalen looked across the field where Riker was helping an elderly wolf repair a fence. "Because some people don't understand what they've lost." He paused, watching Riker quietly lift heavy timber onto his own shoulders, until they're willing to become someone better. Then, a messenger from Silver Ridge arrived, his face pale with urgency. He bowed before Riker. "My Alpha, a rogue alliance has crossed the northern border. They're attacking every pack in their path. The years Riker had spent seeking redemption were about to face their greatest test. The rogue alliance struck without mercy. Village after village burned, as frightened families fled toward safer territories. Warriors from neighboring packs rushed to defend the northern border, but the enemy outnumbered them. Riker stood at the front of the united defense. For the first time, his orders were different. Protect the civilians first. Get the pups and elders to safety. No one gets left behind. Years ago, he would have charged straight into battle, determined to defeat the enemy before anything else. Now, his greatest priority wasn't victory. It was protecting lives. When a collapsing watchtower trapped several young wolves beneath its wooden beams, Riker didn't hesitate. Ignoring the battle raging around him, he raced into the smoke-filled ruins. One by one, he carried the frightened pups to safety. A massive timber crashed onto his shoulder, driving him to one knee. Still, he refused to let go of the last frightened child in his arms. Across the battlefield, Kalen watched in stunned silence. This wasn't the Alpha who had once sacrificed his family for reputation. This was a leader, willing to sacrifice himself for strangers. When the final rogue retreated before sunset, the battlefield fell quiet. Silver Ridge had survived, not because Riker had defeated the most enemies, but because he had saved the most lives. The following morning, wolves from every neighboring pack gathered to thank the rescuers. Many spoke of Riker's courage. Others praised the warriors who had fought beside him. Kalen listened quietly. For the first time in years, he realized the respect surrounding Riker wasn't born from fear. It had been earned. Later that evening, Riker stood alone overlooking the valley, his injured shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages. Kalen approached slowly. "You could have died yesterday." Riker nodded. "I know. Were you afraid?" Riker looked toward the families laughing around the campfires below. "Not of dying," he smiled sadly. "I was afraid Orion might grow up believing I never became the father he deserved." Before Kalen could answer, the pack bell echoed across the valley. Every wolf turned toward the sound. An announcement spread through the camp. The Alpha had called for every member of Silver Ridge to gather before sunrise. No one knew why. Only Riker knew that the hardest battle of his life was about to begin. Before sunrise, every wolf in Silver Ridge gathered in the center of the pack grounds. Warriors stood beside healers. Elders stood beside young pups. No one spoke. They all watched as Riker walked slowly toward the old moonstone, the place where generations of Alphas had sworn to protect their people. For years he had stood there as a leader. Today, he stood there as a man who had failed. Kalen remained near the back of the crowd, with Orion standing beside him, the little pup holding tightly to his father's hand. Riker faced the pack. His voice was steady, but stripped of every trace of pride. For too many years, I believed strength meant never admitting I was wrong. He paused. I was wrong. The words echoed through the silent clearing. I placed power above compassion. I chose reputation over the family, the moon goddess entrusted to me. Then he turned toward Kalen, not as an alpha, not as a ruler, simply as a mate who had finally understood the cost of his own choices. Without hesitation, Riker lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps spread through the crowd. No alpha in Silver Ridge's history had ever knelt before anyone. "I don't deserve another chance," he said quietly. "I missed our son's first laugh, his first steps, the years I can never have back." His eyes glistened as he looked at Orion. "I cannot change the past, but I will spend the rest of my life proving that the wolves I love will never come second again." The clearing remained perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to wait. Orion looked up at Kalen. "Papa." "Why is he kneeling?" Kalen gently squeezed his son's hand. "Because sometimes the strongest apology isn't spoken, it's lived." Then, for the first time since returning to Silver Ridge, Kalen stepped forward. Every wolf held their breath. No one knew whether he was walking toward forgiveness or goodbye. The entire pack watched as Kalen crossed the clearing. No one dared to speak. Even the youngest pups seemed to sense that this moment would become part of Silver Ridge's history. Riker remained on one knee. He didn't reach for Kalen. He didn't ask again. He simply waited. When Kalen finally stopped in front of him, their eyes met for the first time, without anger, regret, or distance standing between them. "You once believed being alpha meant standing above everyone else," Kalen said softly. Riker lowered his head. "I know. And now? Now I know it means standing beside them." A faint smile touched Kalen's lips. It wasn't the smile of someone who had forgotten the past. It was the smile of someone who had witnessed real change. He turned toward Orion. The little pup looked from one father to the other, uncertain what was happening. Kalen knelt beside him. "Do you remember what I always tell you?" Orion nodded. "That good people can make painful mistakes. And what comes after that?" The little wolf thought for a moment before answering. "They have to make better choices." Kalen smiled. "They do." Orion slowly walked toward Riker. For a heartbeat, the mighty Alpha looked more frightened than he had on any battlefield. Then a tiny hand reached for his. "Can we go home now?" Orion asked. Tears filled Riker's eyes as he gently held his son's hand. "I've been trying to find my way home for a very long time." Kalen stepped beside them. "Then let's make sure we never lose it again." The pack erupted into relieved cheers, not because the moon bond had reunited them, but because they had witnessed something far rarer than destiny. They had witnessed redemption. In the months that followed, Silver Ridge became known as the strongest pack in the Northern Territories, not because it had the fiercest alpha, but because it had a leader who listened before he commanded, served before he asked, and loved without placing pride above family. Years later, when Orion became old enough to understand the story of his parents, he never spoke about the day his father knelt. He spoke about what happened afterward. Because a family isn't rebuilt by one apology. It's rebuilt by the promises people keep every single day.